So as we examine consequences of these networks of exchange, all right, there's two main consequences we're concerned about for our purposes. We've seen some of the environmental consequences, at least we've alluded to it in terms of the different foodstuffs, the different exchanges that have occurred when travelers have gone from place to place. When we look at cultural consequences, during our first unit, we addressed population increases. Now we look at population decreases. To put it very simply, different invasions led to some decreases. So raids from what we might call barbarian groups contributed to population decline and growing instability. These invasions, along with various Viking raids, occurred in the early part of what we might call the Middle Ages. They ended after around the 10th century. These raids contributed to the growing instability and decentralization of Europe at this time. Remember, we've looked at decentralization as it pertains to the manorial system and feudalism. These movements, to an extent, enhanced that process. Now, the rise in population that was fueled by new agricultural techniques contributed to more manpower. More people means more men to fight, as English and French rulers engaged in a series of conflicts that we now know as the 100 Years' War. To put it very simply, and to kind of sum it up, the English king believed he was next in line for the French throne in 1337, but his French cousin was selected by the nobles. This is a war, or this is a series of wars, that are fought entirely in France. And France had 15 million people compared to England's 4 million. So some of those agricultural techniques are maybe taking off a bit more in France. Many English, due to the increased wealth of France, were inspired by the chance to plunder. Now this kind of gives us a transition into our next time frame. This will signal a change from mounted knights fighting one another to the use of gunpowder and cannon, which is going to make walled cities obsolete. Armor was too heavy for knights to get up after being dismounted, so they fell out of use. The English will use a weapon called the longbow to their advantage. So there are technological innovations that go along with this idea of decline. France won, but Normandy lost 75% of their population. The Normandy region of France suffered mightily, and here we see a woman named Joan of Arc who didn't exactly see great consequences of this war, or at least immediate personal consequences. England and France will become much more centralized as a result. So there is some decline, but then the buildup reoccurs. And finally, famine. There was a great famine from 1315 to 1322, and it led many to die of starvation. But it also led thousands to flee the countryside to beg in cities. Now, interestingly enough, we will see population decline, but this famine will mark the beginning of the end of feudalism, because rulers needed to obtain more revenue than was traditionally available from the obligations that tied peasants to their lords. So interestingly enough, in 1315, the French king freed all serfs on royal land so that he could tax them more. So it's one of those good news, bad news scenarios. Good news is you're free. Bad news, we're doing it so that we can, tax you more. Landlords in England and Germany also decided to have more short-term leases so they could charge higher rents. So there's a number of different developments that go hand in hand with urban decline. Now, one of the biggest environmental consequences of connectivity, the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Now, we believe that the plague first erupted in 1320 in southeast China, and then in the early 1330s, it erupted in northern China. These were initially isolated incidents. However, protection that the Mongols gave the Silk Roads allowed for the transmission of goods and ideas, but it also sped up the spread of the plague along trade routes into the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Now, the disease itself was carried by rodents, or the virus itself carried by rodents, spread to humans via fleas, and the most likely explanation is that rats boarded trade ships and got off in port towns. The most infamous account of how the plague reached Europe is that the Mongols were laying siege to the Genoese city of Kaffa. Kaffa's on the Black Sea, so it's kind of positioned in between Asia and Europe. The Mongol soldiers are outside this walled city, dying of this disease. The Mongols had an idea that this disease spread person to person. This walled-off city of Kaffa was unaffected until the Mongols started tossing their dead over the city walls. They believed that the stench would cause the city to evacuate. To an extent it did, but once the city emptied, they took the disease with them. They took the disease with them into ports, into trade routes across Europe. Now, when we look at symptoms, it's not great. All right, to sum it up, you start with swelling of the lymph nodes, usually in the groin. Could be other places like your armpits, but usually your lymph nodes will swell up. You'll get headaches, a very high fever, and internal bleeding. Within a few days, you'll be dead. That's just those are the symptoms we know of that we associate with this bubonic plague. Casualty rates were reported at about 50 to 90% within any affected populace. Europe alone lost about half of its population in the initial outbreak of 1348 to 1350. So the mid-1300s is when this breaks out. The Middle East lost about a third of its population by the early 1400s. Now, densely populated areas of China, the Islamic world, and Europe were really affected. Europe's population goes from 75 million to about 55 million, and it wasn't until after 1500 that it returned to its pre-plague levels. So we're talking 150 years later, Europe finally recovers its population. Kind of coincides with Columbus's voyages. Interestingly enough, India and sub-Saharan Africa lost very little in terms of population. They're not necessarily as well connected within these specific trade routes. So that's kind of something to think about. Protected trade routes means disease spread. If you're not part of it, you're not going to get it. Now, anti-Semitism is an unfortunate side effect of the bubonic plague. Now, the Jewish population of these European cities, they weren't really affected as much because they already lived in walled-off areas known as ghettos. And in these Jewish ghettos, they controlled who came and who went, mainly for business purposes. Combine that, because you have a segregated populace, that everyone else, they really don't know what goes on beyond these walls. Combine that with the fact that Jewish laws espoused cleanliness, such as washing your hands before you eat, and washing your hands after using the bathroom. It's not as if Jews didn't get the plague, they just were not even close to as infected as others. Many came to believe that Jews were the cause of the plague, and therefore pogroms took place. The worst pogrom was in Strasbourg, Germany, where several hundred were burned to death and the rest were expelled from the city. Anytime a great calamity, a great disaster occurs, people will look for a scapegoat, and in many cases, the Jews took the blame. Now, responses to the plague differed greatly. Pope Clement VI believed that the plague was divine wrath, God's will, God's punishment. However, he also listened to prominent physicians who advised him to surround himself with lit candles at all times. Now, he ended up surviving this time period, and it was probably because the constant heat of the candles kept the fleas from reaching his body. In Avignon, France, there were so many people who were killed by the plague in 1349 that there was no place to bury the dead. Many were just left exposed in the streets and infected others. The Pope ended up consecrating the Rhone River and throwing infected bodies into it so the current could carry them away. Now, in the Middle East, Muslim doctors had a bit more of an understanding of how the disease spread from person to person, so they believed in isolating people who had the plague. Now, if we look long term, over half of all parish priests died because of their proximity to the deceased and the dying. All right, when people are afflicted with the plague, they want treatment that's comfortable. They want someone they know. They go to the parish priest. Unfortunately, this takes out over half of local priests. Training new priests, it takes time. It simply does. So women will take a larger role in local parishes. This kind of is one of the points where we can look at and say people began to somewhat doubt the faith. They began to doubt that God truly had their best interests at heart. Many believed God had abandoned them. Now, long term, you lose half your population. That's a labor shortage. The survivors truly benefit not only from living, but from the fact that the serfs who survive can bargain for better wages. It also will indirectly lead to this industrial idea of the West, because less people means you want to get the same output with fewer workers. Labor-saving inventions will become a solution to produce what they had before with fewer people, all indirectly due to the horrific nature of the bubonic plague.